Hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this session on ESG regulation. 2022 is proving to be a watershed year for ESG regulation globally. Broadly, regulations are pushing corporates to provide more relevant information to investors and consumers, and investors are being pushed to be more transparent in their definitions of sustainable activities as part of their investment processes. High-level themes include the following. Globally, a desire to limit greenwashing and accelerate capital into themes covered by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Secondly, with the proliferation of ESG funds, corporate targets, and disclosures, there have been a range of regulations to provide transparency, quantification, and assurance around these. Thirdly, on investment implications, ESG fund overweight positions are highly concentrated in the end of the supply chain, the pure plays, solar, wind, and water. The coming disclosures help better inform investors on companies trying to transform themselves, showing rising revenue that satisfies some of the UN SDGs. We're particularly excited by the green-enablers upstream in the value chain in automation, energy efficiency, energy transmission, storage, and green metals. Global ESG investors have a fear of misaligned exposure that may drive competitive pressure to show how low the carbon footprint of their fund is and how aligned it is to the EU taxonomy. Over time, we will likely see a pickup in ESG improver funds in an attempt to mitigate fears of misaligned exposures. Now I'd like to dive into each region. Europe is pushing companies to define what constitutes sustainable revenues and capex via the EU taxonomy. This is helpful for companies in transition, which can have their efforts to transition rewarded via revenue alignment under the EU taxonomy. Asia is on a similar taxonomy path, but is earlier in the process, and at this moment, much more focused on climate reporting. There's a push, especially in Europe and Asia, towards disclosure of climate-related risks. The US, on the other hand, is at an earlier stage than Europe or Asia in ESG regulations, but is focused on transparency around ESG risks and environmental footprint. The SEC is targeting climate reporting and new disclosure rules, but the path taken by the US highlights the SEC's historical approach to be less prescriptive, to protect investors with information that they need, but with less intent to influence capital flows than in Europe. Emissions reporting is one of the bright spots in ESG disclosure in the US. However, companies will need to provide a lot more context around their emissions targets. US reported data is meant for official filing, so this will mean audit and assurance are needed, which will help with investor confidence. The regulator is working on proposals in other areas such as human capital and political spending. These proposals will probably face legal challenges, and any potential changes in the administration will obviously influence outcomes. Moving to more detail on the picture in Asia Pacific, we've seen ESG policies doubling in the region over the past 5 years. This has translated into increased corporate ESG disclosure across most APAC markets. Some of these markets now have disclosures in line or even exceeding those of companies in the US. We've analyzed material ESG regulations across the region, focusing on 6 emerging themes: green taxonomies, climate reporting aligned with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, carbon pricing schemes, supply chains, corporate ESG disclosures, and lastly, ESG fund requirements. 4 key takeaways from our analysis include that policy developments are following European trends, addressing climate, carbon, the supply chain, and ESG disclosures, both corporates and ESG funds. Secondly, demand for climate reporting is increasing from governments and investors and consumers. We believe this will ultimately lead to a similar policy approach to Europe's taxonomy, but with regional nuances. Thirdly, taxonomies and implications for valuation are important. There's evidence of a widening green premium for companies that are highly aligned to the EU taxonomy. This may expand to more sectors as APAC taxonomies emerge. Using the EU taxonomy as a proxy for future APAC standards, we find highly aligned global companies trading at 37% PE and EBITDA sector relative premia, with the smaller group of highly aligned APAC stocks, which are predominantly China wind and solar, trading at 55 and 64% premiums respectively. Carbon will be increasingly important in asset management decisions, which may widen valuation premiums for low-carbon emitters. Low-emitting APAC companies already trade at a 28% PE and 9% EV to EBITDA sector relative premium versus their high-emitting peers, and that compares to 33% PE and a 20% EV to EBITDA premium globally. I'll now go into some of the regulatory themes in more detail. Climate reporting. APAC has made significant progress mandating TCFD-aligned reporting, making the region a leader globally. While we do see increased focus outside Asia looking to implement TCFD-aligned reporting, the focus is often either on investors or corporates, and not both. Singapore, Hong Kong, and New Zealand are at the forefront of imposing mandated requirements on both investors and corporates, with Japan and Malaysia also mandating TCFD reporting for corporates and/or some financial institutions. We expect greater focus on TCFD-aligned reporting from other regulators across the region in the near term, as the global focus on decarbonisation and the climate transition accelerates. Now, taxonomies are another important theme. There's evidence of a widening green premium for companies highly aligned to the EU taxonomy. This may expand to more sectors as APAC taxonomies emerge. Looking ahead, while more APAC taxonomies are emerging, using the EU taxonomy as the baseline, we find the use case in the region is currently limited to bond and loan issuance. If the use case were to expand to a broader disclosure requirement, as we've seen in Europe, APAC companies already partly aligned under EU regulation will likely benefit for increased fund ownership, ESG fund ownership, as more of their activities may be considered green. Then moving on to disclosure. ESG policy development in APAC is improving corporate disclosure. Australia, Thailand, and some other markets have disclosure rates above 70% on the environmental and social metrics that we believe are material as part of the GS Sustain framework. Many other markets in the region disclose 60% or more of these metrics. Mainland China discloses 31%, but new disclosure rules are coming into place, and we believe that this will improve. Corporate ESG disclosure requirements in the region remain focused on emissions, energy, and diversity metrics. However, application varies depending on the country. Companies may be subject to mandatory or comply or explain or even voluntary requirements. APAC corporates should continue to provide material ESG disclosures in preparation for harmonized global standards, which are currently being developed by the ISSB. Moving on to carbon pricing. While it's positive to see pricing schemes emerging across a number of markets, mainland China, South Korea, and New Zealand are examples, we see the impact currently limited by high allocation of free carbon allowances to high carbon emitting corporates. Also, low prices or limited sector coverage are issues. This is largely due to the early stage of development across these markets. Carbon taxes in Japan and Singapore also need to be continually reviewed, a process Singapore is currently undergoing, noting planned future carbon tax increases were not sufficient in the current environment and will be revised upwards. And then to the supply chain. In our view, greater supply chain risk management, due diligence, and transparency policies are needed, most importantly because of Asia's dominant position in the global supply chain, and to prepare APAC corporates for incoming international pressure for transparency and traceability. This comes through a range of international regulations targeting forced labor, traceability, and net zero pledges that mean accountability for carbon emissions in the value chain. Today's disclosures provide not only very high-level information, lacking insight into due diligence and monitoring practices, supplier onboarding, termination approaches. They may also lack enforcement measures from the regulators to encourage strong corporate compliance. Fund reporting. Although regulations are currently lacking in the region, we expect policies mandating ESG fund requirements to accelerate as the risk of greenwashing rises and as consumer and regulatory demand for more product-level transparency increases. ESG-labeled financial product requirements may mandate specific disclosures, for example, explaining how ESG is integrated into the investment process, or mandating specific metric disclosures, or setting investment thresholds. For example, a minimum percentage of assets under management invested in ESG stocks. While existing and new requirements are emerging in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Australia, multiple regulators in other markets have noted the importance of ESG fund disclosure and process requirements, and have indicated that policies are in development, for example, India, Japan, Singapore, in Thailand, and also in ASEAN. Now moving to mainland China, both investors and regulators are pushing for greater ESG transparency on key issues, including decarbonization, to better align their portfolios with ESG objectives. New environmental disclosure requirements that are coming in this year for high carbon emitting companies are a positive step towards improved corporate disclosure. The new emission trading scheme is at an early development stage. Impact on emissions should evolve over time. Now, to an overview of progress. Disclosures. Corporate ESG disclosures will likely improve in mainland China in the near term with the new mandated environmental disclosure requirements for high carbon emitting companies starting from this year. Companies are also encouraged to provide select social disclosures on a voluntary basis, which includes supply chain related metrics. On emissions trading, mainland China launched its National Carbon Emissions Trading Compliance Scheme in 2021, which we expect will continue to expand in coverage in the coming years. The national ETS now covers 40% of China's national carbon emissions. 2,200 utilities companies were included following the launch of the national ETS in 2021, and 7 other industries will be added at an unspecified future timeline. Since the start of trading on July 16th, 2021, carbon prices in the national ETS have fluctuated between 41 to 59 RMB per tonne, in other words, US $6 to $9 per metric tonne of carbon, broadly in line with expectations from industry participants, but lower than the 80 to 100 euro per metric tonne in the European ETS, which is obviously a mature market established in 2005. Market participants in China generally expect prices in the ETS to steadily increase in the long term as, number one, market reforms introduce auctions for allowances, which are currently freely distributed, and secondly, more participants enter the market from industries where emissions are harder to abate, which could add demand for allowances and push prices up. Moving on to green taxonomies, or in other words, in China, the Green Bond Endorsed Project Catalogue. That has been developed, but its use case is currently limited to bond issuance. Today, eligible projects are determined based on their contribution to 3 environmental objectives: climate change response, secondly, environmental improvement, in other words, pollution control and ecological conservation, and thirdly, more efficient resource utilization, the circular economy, waste recycling, and pollution prevention. The latest update to the Green Bond Catalogue, effective from July 2021, most notably removed clean coal as an eligible green activity and harmonizes different green bond standards previously set by a number of regulatory bodies within China. China has arguably taken a stronger stance than that of the European Union by excluding gas and liquefied natural gas, along with coal-fired power activities from eligible activities under the taxonomy. In contrast, the potential inclusion of natural gas in the EU green taxonomy has triggered ongoing market-wide debate, with opposing arguments believing that natural gas is a fossil fuel that should not be defined as green or sustainable, as it opens the door for continuing to attract capital and it disincentivizes transition towards a no-carbon energy source. Other regulations include those on ESG funds, guided by voluntary ESG, and green guidelines by the Asset Management Association of China, or AMAC. There have been no significant developments at this point relating to TCFD-aligned climate reporting to date. Other developments include China's 14th five-year plan to guide national ESG policies and also a new sustainable financing evaluation plan for banks. What are the opportunities? We see opportunities to expand China's green taxonomy beyond sustainable bond and loan issuance to become a disclosure requirement and to mandate greater supply chain, TCFD-aligned climate reporting and ESG fund requirements.